Hi everyone, this is a special video today. In lieu of me just talking and boring all of you with talks about post-Civil War, today we are joined by Mr. James Bishop. James, thanks for joining us.
No problem, Phil.
Uh, Mr. Bishop is currently working on his doctorate down in Louisiana State University. He and I have been friends. Uh, Boy, it feels like forever, but it's really only, what's it been, like 10 years?
10 years, yeah.
Something like that. So he is currently working in the American history field on mostly revolutionary America, but I brought him in today because he is way smarter than me on American history, and so we're gonna have we're gonna have a short conversation today just about how the United States really started, I guess, kind of developing into this north-south divide. Okay, so if you hear me call him Gifford, that's because that's his name, and that's what I'm just going to call him from now on. All right, Gifford. When it comes to post-revolution America, so we're talking about like right when the Constitution gets written. How would you describe it? Is it like a united country? Is it a divided country? If there are divisions, what are the divisions in America right after the Constitution is written?
Well, right after the Constitution's written, most Americans at this time would probably still identify more with their individual state than they would as an American overall, although there is a sense of nationality at the time, albeit somewhat looser.
Okay. And that's a lot different than today in modern America, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah, where like in America today, we think of ourselves as Americans, and then we think of ourselves as Louisianans or Illinoisans next.
Yes. I would have been the opposite, probably in 1790.
Sure, sure. And so, when does slavery really start becoming a issue with Americans? In your
Probably right around the turn of the century into the 19th century. Most slavery by the Constitution era had pretty much died out in the northern colonies. Not completely yet, but most northerners have started to shy away from slavery overall. The South, on the other hand, with the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1794 and by other discoveries in terms of industrialization, all that kind of stuff, cotton production and therefore slavery really started to take off in the South by 1820, 1830 especially.
Okay. And so really it really wasn't like a moral issue for the Northerners, wasn't it, to not have slavery? It was more of an economic um, idea.
I would say it's a little bit of both, especially in terms of economics, sure. But I think there was also some sense by some Northerners that slavery just wasn't going to work out in the North. Nope, I lost your audio.
They become like the immigration hub. Cities like New York City see huge neighborhoods of, like, at this time, your Irish and German Americans moving over. Um, Obviously, the South had some cities where immigration was a thing,
Sure.
but do you have any idea like why the South was never an immigration center?
most most of northern cities had factories, had other jobs that immigrants could take over easily, didn't have to have much skill to do. So therefore, that was where the jobs were in the north mostly.
Sure.
As far as other southern cities go, I mean, you still have big cities like Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, which are still pretty big hubs in terms of trade, but you don't see much of that in terms of immigration, though.
So I guess what one way of kind of putting it is like the North is more of has more opportunities for immigrants to live and work than the South would.
Absolutely, I would agree with that.
Okay. Um, oh, I was just about to ask a question, a follow-up question. Oh, here it is. I think one thing that like students at the level that I teach, and maybe students at the level that you teach, don't understand when it comes to this time period for like the average Southerner, that like they really didn't interact with slaves themselves. The average Southern farmer.
That's true. Actually, most Southerners did not own slaves, and if they did, they only owned maybe 3 to 5 slaves. The big plantation style stuff that you see in movies that you hear about, that was relatively rare. Although, I mean, when you have 100 so slaves on a plantation, that takes most of the production of slavery into that one area.
Sure. And I guess, another thing that's usually confusing for kids when they study this time period is then why did that average Southern farmer who maybe like actually never met a slave in his life, why in like 30 years would he fight for slavery? Was he fighting for slavery or was he fighting for something else?
I think he was probably fighting for something else. Most of the Southerners that were fighting in the Civil War would probably say they were fighting for either states' rights, whatever you want, however you want to define that term, or
Sure.
else, or else they were fighting for to protect their homes, to protect their cities, to protect their people, their families. People were invading their homeland. Of course, you're going to stand and fight no matter what else you believe in.
Sure. So for like maybe the average Southern, even though really we can look at the Civil War as it was about slavery and all the aspects of slavery, but for the individual soldier, that sometimes is different. The reason that they would fight in the Confederate Army.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
And so maybe like turning over to the North, then I know like there's a lot of factors that led to the North being this like industrial hub. Was that in place during the Revolution era that the North was that industrial hub, or was that something that developed after the Revolution?
There were seeds of it before the revolution, but I would say it mostly took off after the revolution by say late 1790s, early 1800s, especially.
Mm.
Industrialization had taken off in the
Mm.
north.
And so, like, if you could list like the biggest factor for the North that led to that, I think sometimes students they look at a period or like a period of time or like a region of the world and say, well, why don't other regions do what they did? Like they'll say like, oh, why is New York City this big metropolis, but why doesn't like South Carolina have all those things that New York does? How much does geography play into this?
Absolutely, geography is one of the biggest factors in this. I mean, the South is more conducive to farming, to growing cotton, to growing other cash crops, whereas the North wasn't that way. So they had to find other ways to make money to become economic hubs. And through that, industrialization was probably the easiest way for them to do that.
Okay, yeah. I think another one that we'll ask is about. We've talked a little bit about like the average Southerner. Now maybe like turn over to like the average Northerner, and I guess like one question we can start of how would you describe maybe like the average Northerner in that post Constitution antebellum time period? What would they usually be doing?
Most Northerners by this time were either wage workers, which would mean they were working for an hourly wage in a factory, or else they would be subsistence farming, which means, farming enough for their families to live on. Um, Most of the time, the average Northerner didn't really have any invest any reasons to invest into something like slavery or something like that, if that makes sense.
Sure. So like it comes back down to that economic reason of it just wasn't available for a lot of Northerners. The
Absolutely.
price.
Yes.
Yeah. And so we did a video last week, which based on the views, my seventh graders aren't watching, but with we talked about abolitionism
Ooh,
and
yes.
just I think one thing that another misconception that students have sometimes is that everybody was an abolitionist in the North. And that's not really the case, is it?
It is not. Actually, probably only a small sliver of the population in the North was abolitionist or even anti-slavery.
And I usually chalk that up to, of course, good old fashioned racism in a sense that it's horrifying, was a big factor to that. But also there was a little bit of an economic factor to anti-abolitionist sentiment in the North, wasn't there?
Yes, there was. Most Northerners, especially people like Irish and German immigrants, did not want African Americans infringing on their ability to work in the factories.
Yeah, and so it was kind of like an idea that if the slaves were freed, a lot of them would want to leave the North and they'd come to these industrial hubs and really just take jobs from the lower working white Americans. That was the idea that they had.
Exactly. Yes, yeah. That was exactly what their fear was.
And so, like, really, when it comes to the Northern cause in the Civil War, for the most part, most of the Union soldiers, just like how the Southern soldiers weren't necessarily in their own beliefs fighting for slavery, the Northern soldiers weren't really fighting for slavery, were they?
Especially during the beginning. If you asked a Northern soldier by 1861, 1862 what they were fighting for, most of them would say they're fighting to protect the Union, which is what Lincoln's stated goal was.
Right. Right, and yeah, like Lincoln's a great example of this, of kind of like a Northern idea of opinion on slavery, with his famous quote, like when he was running for president in 1860, he said, "If I could preserve the Union without freeing the slave, I would do it. If I could preserve it with leaving some in bondage and freeing others, I'd do it. And then if I could do it with freeing all of them, I'd do it." I think I got that in reverse order, but
no, you got that right. That's right. No.
Yeah, like basically, like it really wasn't about slavery for the majority of Americans until the Emancipation Proclamation.
Exactly. That was a huge turning point in the war.
And I guess maybe like the one final question we can do for the wrap up is, what, like, today when we study this time period, slavery is such a big topic. It's something that is always on our minds when we study the antebellum era. And I guess maybe a question that we can discuss is, why was slavery not more of a moral issue for a lot of Americans back then? Is it really just because they grew up with it, or what was going on?
I think that's certainly part of it, that it was just, by this point, it was certainly just normal, at least into the regards that slavery can be normal.
Sure.
But I believe most people, it either didn't affect them directly, aka the North, or they had just grown up around it in the South, and so it didn't really bother them much anymore. I think that's certainly the biggest aspect of it.
And it's kind of a useful thing for us in modern day to kind of see what sort of injustices do we just kind of let slip by because they've been normalized.
Exactly. I think that's a huge issue today as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much, future, I guess I'll say Professor Bishop, soon to be Dr. Bishop, hopefully, right?
Hopefully.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And folks, if you have further questions about post-revolution antebellum era, you can go ahead and comment below, and maybe we'll do something like this again on the channel. But if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe to Mr. H on YouTube. And we'll see you all again soon. Bye.